Hello, everyone. This video is to cover how to find sources for your poetry explication. All right, so the first thing that we need to go over briefly here is credibility. Because the sources for your poetry explication can come from pretty much anywhere, and they don't have to come from the library databases, we want to talk about what makes someone or something credible, right? So credibility is the quality of being trusted and believed in. It means that you come across as somebody who sounds like they know what they're talking about. If I came into class in my pajamas on the first day of school with my hair all messed up, nobody would think I'm the professor just because I wouldn't look credible. Unless we're in like philosophy or something, maybe, right? Something that they're trying to be out there on purpose. But in general, that is going to detract from my credibility, right? Websites are the same way. So when we go online onto the internet, if something is credible, it's going to have certain qualities about it that exude trustworthiness, right? We'll be able to find and locate the author. The author will have credentials. There'll be links to where they got their sources from. If any of those things are not there, you know that it's a less credible website. Um, the website is kind of like in its pajamas, if you will, right? If it doesn't have these kinds of things. So how do we know if a source is credible? Let's go over some of these items together. The first one is the URL address. So a credible website typically comes from a .org or .edu website. These are website endings that you can't just go online and register for, okay? I have a .com and a .net in my name for my poetry stuff, and all I had to do was pay a certain amount of money and it's mine, okay? That doesn't make me credible necessarily. I mean, I am credible in certain ways, but I could have put anything up there, right? And so it's not necessarily as reliable something that comes from .org or .edu, where the purpose behind that website is for education or it is for an organization. It's not to make money off of you or sell you something. .com stands for commercial, actually. So when the internet was first being formed, that .com is, there to indicate them selling you something. Now, there are certain exceptions to this. In the library databases, you will notice that something like JSTOR has a .com in the initial web address. That's because they are selling a subscription to our library for those articles, okay? So it's a little bit tricky there, but across the web, if you're just Googling things or you're using Gemini or something or ChatGPT, and they're directing you to a .com site, it's not the best, okay? The databases are clearly different from Google. I'm sure you know this already, but those are vetted sources. Scholars have gone through those. It's very, very difficult to be published in a journal that ends up in a library database, okay? It has to go through multiple checks along the way by peers, by scholars, people vetting it, telling you to change something, telling you missed something. I just went through this process myself over the last couple of years. It takes years to get an article in there. And I just want you to know it's a lot different from something like Google, or again, if you're using a generative AI to help you find sources, it's completely different. You have to do that vetting yourself, okay? The other thing that you want to look at is the date, of course. For scientific information, this is obvious, right? You want the most up-to-date information. But also, for something like a poetry explication, if you are writing about somebody's experience, like for example, Mary Oliver is a famous poet and she writes poems about her experience of being a gay woman, a lesbian. Now, Mary Oliver has passed. So the date that, she was feeling these feelings is not current. It's not the 2020s, right? It's actually back in, the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s. What was that like for her? So if I want a source about that explores, what it was like to be a lesbian woman in that time, I need to pay attention to the date and say, is it talking about that right time period? I don't want something that talks about, 2025 or, something current, right? Okay. So we do want to pay attention to the date. Like I said earlier, it should link to other credible sources, all right? And the author themselves should be credible. These are all things that you should be able to check out on the site. If you can't check it out, if these things are not clickable or not findable, it's a clue that it's not reliable, okay? Quick difference between primary and secondary sources because you're working with both for this project. Primary sources provide firsthand or direct information. That is the original text or photograph or video or audio recording or the person who was there, okay? It's the letter, the diary, the government document, the speech, the literature, the art, the poem itself is a primary source, okay? If something went down in a class, right, like something crazy happened, you all would be primary sources as witnesses. Like you'd be like, I was there, I'm a primary source, right? And then if your friend heard about it and told somebody else, your friend would be a secondary source, okay? Because they are telling you about what the primary source experienced, okay? So secondary sources are oftentimes what we find in library databases, in articles, in news articles about things, movie reviews, scientific studies sometimes have news articles written about them. So the scientific study itself would be the primary source, but the thing you're reading that's telling you about it is actually a secondary source, okay? At least if you're reading about it in the mainstream news, that kind of thing, okay? So you need to find two secondary sources for this project. They do not need to be about the primary source. Like it doesn't have to be a website or a journal article dissecting your chosen poem. In fact, it's going to be really hard to find that because I chose all very current poetry, okay? So it'll be near impossible, but you can find other sources that relate to the themes within the piece itself. So let's say that you are writing about Choi's salvage poem, right? You could write about the overpopulation of deer. You could write about abuse and trauma, and you could certainly find secondary sources on those themes and then show how it adds to or helps you unpack the poem to have that information. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so here are some places that you can look for secondary sources for your poetry explication paper. The first one is Poetry Unbound. You'll be familiar with this. This is the podcast that unpacks poetry. You don't want to steal anything directly from Project Otuma because this is, you're doing something very similar. But it's a great place to look for and, maybe quote him. You could pull a quote from him. You could see how he unpacks a piece. There's also a few poetry websites here, Modern American Poetry, Poets, and Poetry Foundation. A lot of times they will have some information about the author. So even if they don't dissect the poem itself on the website typically, they might have quotes from someone like Mahogany Brown. They might have quotes from somebody that you're interested in helping you unpack the poem, okay? So take a look at those. The next one here is Consensus. This is a generative AI database that's actually reliable, okay? So it pulls from sources that can be found in the library databases. The one thing that you need to be careful of is it's just like Google Scholar in that you might hit a paywall with the sources that it points you towards. So if you decide to use Consensus, you want to have your library database website open as well, so you can find the actual source in the library database in order to get access to it and not hit that paywall, okay? Now, you can explore the theme of the poem through another reliable site or database. It does not have to be these, okay? You're not tethered to these at all. In fact, it's very open-ended. So let me show you Consensus here since that one's generally new for folks, okay? So Consensus, again, is this sort of AI search database thing that's pretty cool because you don't have to change the way that you word your question or the way that you put in search terms. You can literally just ask it a question. So you might ask something like, how does trauma affect people's outbursts as adults? Okay, if I'm writing about salvage here, maybe I'm thinking about, this trauma that the speaker has experienced and how they sort of have this outburst in the poem a little bit. And all I have to do is just type in the question however I've worded it. And what'll happen here is it'll come up with a little synopsis of key points. And then within the key points, there are numbers that will take you to a source down below. And then you can click on the source and, of course, see if you have access to it. It has a link to the full text here, and you can explore this. Again, have that library database website opened if you don't have full access to it. So I'll show you what to do here. So if I'm on the Northampton website, right, I'm going to go over to the library services. I'm going to copy and paste this title in here and see if they have it. Okay. So let's take a look. Taking a second here to load the results, and there it is. Looks like they do have it. So that's great. So you can choose your access options online or PDF. All right. You can also read the abstract here. It gives you a little study snapshot. It gives you 10 for free, I think. So, and then you have to pay. I've never paid for anything on Consensus. It does reset after a little bit. I've come back to the main page here. Let's say I read this synopsis and I'm thinking that question isn't really getting me what I want. You can put another question in. You can also take a look at the suggested related questions here. And then here's their full list of sources below. Now, like I said, these sources you don't have to worry about, okay? So it's not something where it's like, oh shoot, what do I do here? I I have to vet it or something. They are coming from vetted sources, which is awesome. Okay. So as a reminder, you need 2 or more secondary sources for this paper, and all of these are linked on here for you to explore. And only one primary source should be used, your poem. Okay. Of course, if you have an interview with an author or a quote from an author, that's perfectly fine for a secondary source. Okay. That works. All right. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, have fun digging around and finding sources.